my heart, I wish that she would have just listened to me from the beginning. Don't lie. Just don't lie. But I also was really thankful that I could look her in the eyes and say, I am so thankful that Jesus is showing you the consequences of sin.
Welcome back, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Wonderful to have you along. Today, we're going to continue the second part of the conversation I had with Brian and Alison Sutter on the topic of parenting styles. Thanks for being here. All right, so let's go back to this continuum. We've talked about high truth and low grace. Mm-hmm. We've briefly mentioned high truth and high grace, which I see that story really articulating that well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, let's choose another one.
Yeah.
Maybe it's low grace, low truth.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
So the label that we've put on that one is uninvolved. And that one, like all of these, like no parent wakes up, I think, and just says, "Oh, I'll be uninvolved." I'm not going to do my responsibilities. But rather, it's one that often comes from, I think, in my view, is like good motives, but it leads to stepping out of the role of parenting. So, for example, the dad who says, "You know what? I'm going to provide for my family and work really hard." A great motive, but then what accidentally happens is that becomes the only focus. And then they're always gone, whether it's at work or travel or when they are home. They're so overwhelmed with other things that they're not actually present. And so a good desire to provide leads to being uninvolved in parenting would be an example. Mm-hmm. I think other examples might be like, someone who, even seen where somebody who has a heart for other people, maybe really strong faith, they want to serve, and again, a great desire, but then all of their energy goes into serving outside of the home.
Even in the ministry.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. And a wonderful thing, but then neglecting the home and the responsibility that the Lord's put there. And again, these are hard things. It's not like you're choosing between a bad thing and a good thing. It's two good things, but needing to make sure that parenting in the home is one of those good things you say yes to. Mm-hmm. And that might mean that you can't do something in the ministry, or you can't serve at the food pantry, or whatever that might be.
Yeah. And sometimes I wonder, too, uninvolved, I think that there's a certain amount of defeatist, maybe, mentality that says, I don't have the skill set. Speaking to that mindset.
And I think even in Alison and I, we've talked about this. It's the reason why we even hesitate to share, one of those good stories like she just articulated with Kennedy. Like, that's not every day, right? That's like a bright spot where we're like, yes, that went.
Hey, we did it right. Yeah, I think I did it right then.
Right. But yeah, when you're discouraged and you hear a story like that, or you hear about your friend who's reading this book, or this is going on, it can be so discouraging. And I think I would just encourage that parent to say, yeah, you may not be an A+ parent, but God's equipped you and giving you the privilege of stewarding these young souls, and you may not be very good at it, but by God's grace, you can grow and learn, and they'll teach you a lot. You'll learn, they'll learn a lot from you, and just try to step into that journey, even though it's uncomfortable, which, again, that's hard, but I think it's important.
As a stay-at-home mom, I see social media being really influential in how we view ourselves as moms. Mm-hmm. And when you look at all the highlights going on in other people's lives, you can feel like you are a hot mess really quickly. And I see moms just wilt under the pressure to be that perfect mom that they see on their screen every day. And so I think that can also push us back into, I can't do it that well, and so I'm not even going to try. And that can be really dangerous. And it's so important to recognize that God gave you these children specifically in your family, and He has given you what you need through His grace to raise them. And it can feel like other people are doing it so much better than you, or on such a different level, and your kids would just be better if they were, had a different, better mom. Given them up. It can be such cruel thoughts to think to yourself, and to take those captive and to say, I recognize that I'm not perfect, but this is the role that I've been given, by a divine creator that knows me and knows my strengths and weaknesses, knows my kids, and he thought this was a good idea. So I'm going to lean into that.
Yeah. Yes, there's things that I can do better, and yet there is grace and there's patience and there's growth that's expected to be part of it. And if we can speak in that into our own hearts, and then that can flow out into our kids, and that could be something that we teach them through our imperfect parenting, like what a gift. If they see that modeled in how we interact with ourselves and our own heart, as well as then as we interact with them, admitting our imperfections but seeking to grow. Wow.
That's good. So let's go now look at the high grace, low truth. What does that look like?
Yeah, and that would be more in the permissive lens, and even just your comments you just had, Allison, with the uninvolved made me think of it too, that I think social media can certainly play a role there. So the permissive is one who maybe is going to be quick to give the grace, maybe show mercy, let things pass. There's not going to be many rules or expectations, and a lot of times I think that can come from like not wanting your kids to experience any pain, or I think in our current culture, the definition of what it means to be a good dad or a good mom is to help your kids avoid all pain, and that leads us down the road of being permissive.
Yeah, there are some of us who tend towards high grace, low truth, right? Our hearts are bleeding for the difficulty that our child has endured.
Right.
Okay, so come along and coach us. What needs to be included in that encounter to help bring truth into the picture?
Well, I think one thing that comes to mind and some of what you guys are articulating is just the need to help the child also view more than just their pain. So, for example, what else is going on? What are some of the circumstances, and how can they engage those? So let's say Johnny goes to school and his friend is mean to him. Like we want to hurt with him about that. And also we want him to think about, okay, what was your interaction with Johnny like? And how can you engage that interaction in a way that is honoring and is wise, and not just us thinking about what's wrong with Johnny and why did he do that and Johnny shouldn't have done that, but also, okay, what can you do, and what does your interaction with Johnny next time look like, if that makes sense?
Yeah. You engage that issue, and maybe not cast it as a misfortune, that you are at the end of a lot of misfortune, which is really hard, but you are at the end of a broken world.
Right, yeah. Yes.
That afflicts all of us. And
Yeah, I think it's really a view of trying to help them move away from just seeing their circumstances to being able to see more than that.
I mean, I think it's probably not an uncommon experience to have spouses on different continuum emphases, right? Maybe one tending towards truth, one tending towards grace, right? When you hear the disciplinary action of your spouse, you kind of like wag your head and you're like, oh no, right? And the other of you, like, no, they're not seeing something, like they need to be way too lenient, right?
Yeah.
So then can I ask you, what's your tendency in that? When you see the opposite side come out, what is your natural tendency?
Well, I think what I have found to be challenging is now we've got in that moment another layer of issue to resolve, and I'm not sure it all needs to be resolved in that moment. We've got the disciplinary action with the child, and then the disagreement between the two of us.
Right.
Maybe I'll say what I've noticed doesn't work well is to compensate in that moment in the direction that I think it needs to be filled, because it belittles the actions of the other inside of the child. Does that make sense? Which is now an offense towards the spouse.
Yeah, no, and I think that's such an important point there, Matt, that's the natural tendency. When you have different styles or opposing styles, and you see your spouse going towards, let's say, truth, but you're more of the grace one, that you tend to try to overcompensate, and what that happens then is parents are moving away from each other towards trying to balance this thing. And what we really want to do is say, wait, how do we both move towards each other, towards a goal of being full of both, rather than trying to compensate for each other, which is the most natural.
And one major indicator is the child itself. Well, I'm going to go talk to Mom about this.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a pretty good indicator that they're expecting a different jury outcome with Mom than they do with Dad or whatever.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you've got Mom and Dad against each other. The kids are smart. They figure that out pretty quick. And parenting is hard enough when you're working together and when you're kind of taking opposite positions. It just is... And so I think that's where just being aware of that can be helpful in saying, okay, wait, yeah, this is really uncomfortable because I see them doing something outside of my comfort zone and I want to jump in and do what's natural to me. But reality is there's probably wisdom in what they're doing, and there's wisdom in what I'm maybe tendency, and how after this interaction can we move towards each other and supporting each other, and then over time maybe in being able to trust some feedback in the moment of, hey, would you be open to maybe thinking this, let's just have a discussion around this? Or I think it's time probably for a consequence now that we could trust each other.
And if I can maybe distill a few things. Okay. So with this continuum here, we've talked about we can be a judge, or we could be permissive, or we could be neglecting, right?
Right.
But we want to become more like Christ, to be both truth and grace.
Right.
That's the sweet spot.
That's the goal, yep.
And even in our differences in spouses, this might be God's tool to bring us to that good place.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Right? One spouse sees it more truth-oriented, one sees it more grace-oriented. If we can properly learn from one another and help each other see this lens through this lens, then we're probably more apt to get to that good spot.
If you can recognize value in that, it can feel like a real sore spot or a real place of contention because you are so different. But if you can recognize the value that between the two of you, there is a more complete picture, that can be really helpful, but difficult. And
being able to, in that, just learn from each other. And I think what Satan loves to do is to begin to paint these pictures of the other one about, how they're ridiculous one way or the other, or how they don't care if it's more of the uninvolved. And to be able, again, to recognize those stories that are going on in our hearts and saying, okay, what does it look like for me to move towards Christ, and invite my spouse to move towards them as well. And if we can do that together, by God's grace, hopefully we can both be refined.
Right. Or even if one spouse maybe tends towards the truth, to use the other spouse who tends towards grace and to really allow them to minister and say, you know what, we need to discipline Johnny.
Right.
And you need to be a part of that discipline. Because this is the way I see it, and I need you there to provide that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What a team effort, right?
Yeah.
That is, again, moving towards each other amid the differences. That's a totally acknowledging difference.
Right.
But towards.
Yeah, right? And to acknowledge that that's going to be really difficult. If you're the judge, your mind's going to be going down that, well, if I let this slide, then it's going to be the next thing, and then it's going to be the next thing. And how can I do that? I mean, this is my child's soul. Like that's where your heart's going to go.
Yeah.
And to be able to say, wait a second, okay, maybe I need to slow down and trust the wisdom, and vice versa. The one that's full of grace, the more that's more permissive. Oh no, if they do this, maybe they'll rebel, and maybe and you've got your own story of why you do what you do, and they're both true. But you're going to have to get outside of your comfort zone and be influenced by each other. Otherwise, you're just going to move away from each other.
Yeah.
So recognizing that you see a partial picture of the whole. It's important.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing that can happen too in these styles is if you have similar styles, then the difficulty there is you probably have the similar blind spots, and that there's nobody to kind of help check it exactly. So in those situations, if you guys can just both be aware of it and say, okay, wait a second, are there other things we need to be considering? And maybe even inviting like a mentor couple or a mom you really respect who's maybe good at the place that's hard for you, that can minister into those things and just help check that a little bit.
You know, it's something that I'm finding out more and more as my children get older is how I'm leaning on the church community to raise them. To allow other people to speak into their life. And really what that does is really it just opens that up to say, yes, talk to so-and-so.
Yeah.
It's not actually an easy spot to be in, right?
It's uncomfortable.
Because of some harried messes that happen at home,
Right.
where I acknowledge that probably did that wrong, and then giving the child permission to be cared for by other people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, man.
It reveals, I mean, I shudder to think of what they share about Dad, right?
Right, yeah.
But that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
What a beautiful picture of the body of Christ to invite people into, to recognize. I mean, we're talked so much more about in Scripture as a body than individuals. And I think so often we see ourselves so much more as individuals. And my tendency is I can think I'm responsible for these kids. It's my fault they're here to begin with. And so I have to pick up the pieces when things fall apart. Yeah. And man, what a messy place that gets us into, because it makes our view of our role really unhealthy, where we're responsible for all the mess. And it shuts people off to show up and really give a picture of the body and community and how we need other people.
It's something that occurred to me when I taught in the high school setting, is I felt like I was pretty good with discipline with other people's children. And I realized that I wasn't as good with my own. And I further realized why.
Okay.
And that was because I cared for my own in such a unique and special way that I was afraid.
Sure.
I was afraid of getting it wrong. So I probably got it wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was so afraid of what they would turn out if I don't get it right. So in that amped up setting with that pressure and fear, I probably didn't get it right.
Yeah.
But I was able, with more objectivity in a classroom. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think there's just so much at stake with our own children that other perspective from others is, I think, life-giving.
Maybe a good question for us to be just chewing on, whether it's thinking about reaching out for the community or thinking about our own interaction with our kids and parenting, like to just be contemplating, what am I afraid of? What am I fearful of? Am I fearful that this person, their feedback, am I fearful of what's going to happen with my child in the future, or what's going to happen today? And just how is those fears, whatever they are, influencing how I'm interacting with people, how I'm, engaging the world, and is that something that needs to shift or not? Because, maybe some of those things are helpful and appropriate, but many times fear just drives us down a road of pulling back from community, from pulling back from those moments with our kids that we need to engage, and isn't helpful.
Yeah. This has been excellent, and I think all of us who are parents, different points here in this podcast of like, yes, that I can smell that, I can taste that, I can see that in myself, I can see that in my spouse. I can even see how I would like to become and grow. And you started, Brian, with that this is a growth thing. Sometimes I shake my head at my older children thinking, I'm sorry. Listen, I'm just sorry. You know what I mean?
Right.
But maybe I shouldn't be so arrogant to think I'll do any better with the younger ones. But there is a growth thing here, right?
Yes,
There's we learned from that.
Yeah.
I want you to speak now as we conclude about God's overarching fatherhood with our children. The buck doesn't stop with us, wonderfully.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you mentioned, nobody's perfect, and we'll fail in some major ways.
Right.
But there's even hope in that scenario.
Right. Yeah, and I think the hope is if we can acknowledge that and even just engage that, and then again use that to continue to point our own hearts as well as our kids' hearts towards the perfect Father, the perfect place where there is always hope. And it's not a matter of we get perfect and then we're accepted. It's a matter of we are accepted and then we get to enjoy that.
2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "And we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another," recognizing that we have an important role, but the power of transformation in our kids' lives comes straight from the glory of the Lord. It's not the going out, the getting it right, the check the list, right? It's sitting face to face with the glory. That's what's going to transform us. And I think that's why sometimes it's so hard for us to pull those two definitions of grace and truth together, because we want to have more of an influence, right? We want to be able to do more to make things right and to do things well. And God says, my heart is way bigger than you making day-to-day right decisions with your kids. My heart is that you both, through this, would be transformed. Yeah. And I'm so thankful that my Father cares way more about the big picture than how I respond to my kids when I'm really frustrated, or how I respond to them when they come home from school. There's so much forgiveness there, but there's so much hope that we can be transformed from the inside out by his power and by the glory that comes from the Word of God.
I love that, Allison. That's, I think, a terrific way to conclude our time together, to see the heart of the Father and his work in all of our lives and our children's lives as well. His heart is for them, and to see them changed, again, like you said, not by a string of right decisions, but by the result of one right decision, and that is just to behold him, to be facing him, to be open towards him. Yeah. And there's a lot I can't do, but I think I can do that one, which is pretty exciting. Yeah, so thanks, everyone, for being along with us for this time together as we consider and think and be introspective about our parenting and see maybe a larger landscape for it. We're always anxious and happy to hear comments or perhaps suggestions or questions. Feel free to email us at office@accounseling.org if you'd like. And with that, have a great day.